Dave Pietrzewski
David Pinsoff,
podcast about
evolutionary psychology,
tagline is
actual evolutionary psychology.
by actual evolutionary psychologists, and this is what it is.
Yep, let's continue listening.
Okay, David. Paul Smaldino is a. I don't know. How would you characterize Paul Smaldino?
Um, hmm. Polymathic,
Mm,
um,
good word.
rigorous, insightful, um, musical genius. He has a band called Small Dinosaurs.
Oh, nice. Is it
Uh,
is it ongoing?
I don't know.
We
We
didn't
talked
ask
about it a
him.
bit.
Yeah,
I think we talked about it a bit at the end of the
yeah,
episode.
yeah.
Um,
I don't know. I didn't listen yet.
I haven't
It
listened to
doesn't
the music.
exist. No, I haven't listened to the episode. I can
You,
can
I
I
mean,
can I
you
tell
were
you?
there during the
No, I know,
episode.
but I honestly I do. I often re-listen to our episodes because I've heard other podcast hosts say this that they're so paying attention to the conversation
Mhm.
that they don't hear everything the real time.
Well,
Or
there's
they do,
definitely a
but it's a different way
difference.
of processing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a different mind because like when you're in the middle of a conversation, you're thinking about what you're going to say next and what question you're going to ask and like, how to interact with the person. But when you're
Right.
listening as a bystander or as a third party, you get
Yeah.
to just take in the whole gestalt in a very different way.
Yeah. So what you're saying is we don't listen to the guest when we're interviewing. No, kidding. No, no, no. It's the opposite, actually. For me, it's like it's so much that I am so carefully listening to what they're saying and then trying to figure out where to go.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, this is probably very boring for listeners. But anyway, the point is, I don't remember that from the Paul Smaldino episode. But what I do remember is the Lego solar system.
Yes, we did talk about a Lego solar system,
Yeah. So by
along
now,
with
I'm
many
sure
other
you
things.
can't
Yeah.
wait to hear this episode. So I think,
Well, I mean, what else? We talked about
I
mathematical
mean,
models,
yeah, the
covert
main thing is like
signaling.
why models are stupid. We need more of them, which is, a thing. We talked about
Yeah.
the natural selection of bad science.
Oh
Um,
yeah, big. Yeah, we talked about
yeah.
that a lot.
I
Yeah.
mean, I think the bottom line thing with Paul is that he is embodying and is a voice about it doesn't matter what people intend, whether it's social policy or good science or bad science. What matters is the selection criteria of the institutions. And he's doing modeling and empirical work all about that. And I think the more that everybody sort of gets on board with whatever people intend, what we select for is what we get. I think that's a really important thing, and I think that's sort of what the conversation was about.
Yeah, it was a fun one. We also get into punk rock and
Mm.
covert signaling, sending signals that some people might get and some people might not get. So hopefully, this podcast will be full of signals that you get and no one else gets. Or
And
maybe we want everyone to get it. I don't know.
uh,
You be the judge.
you be the judge. All right,
Enjoy.
enjoy the episode. So yeah, let's get started. Paul is we always do just an intro beforehand, so we can just get right into it. David, do you wanna start with this or
Sure.
yeah?
Well, I am David Pinsoff. That is an identity. Uh,
I know I have a prediction, but I'm not. I'll shut up. I'll let you ask the question. Yeah.
well, it's not necessarily the type of identity that Paul Smaldino is interested in, because there's only one David Pinsoff so far as I'm aware. But Paul, you're interested in identities that many people share and what functions they serve. This is a huge topic in uh, life as we know it in the United States and in many other places. There's lots of talk about identity, who I am, who we are. Uh, you have a very interesting way of thinking about it. So, what is your way of thinking about it?
Yeah. I mean, I think identity is just sort of wrapped up. It's hard to be a person in the world and not have identity be something that you think about a lot. Uh, and I think the way that a lot of people think about it is very sort of phenomenologically, meaning like the experience of who I am in the world and what that means to me Um, and I think about things that's true. Like that is a true thing about identity and a real thing and an important thing about identity. But I'm much more interested in its aspect as like the functional role of identity. What's identity for, and how do we use it purposefully? And this is where I think sort of evolutionary thinking, be it genetic evolution or sort of cultural evolution, which I tend to be a bit more interested in. But, you know, the way we identify ourselves and the way we categorize others based on, well, our identity categories. And identity is just a sort of a kind of category that we impose on other people. Uh, we use that for all kinds of adaptive decision making. Like, how do we find partners for cooperation or finding a romantic partner or friends? How do we use what we perceive about something in order to gauge what kind of interaction we can have with them, whether it's at the store or a stranger or at a party or in a classroom? Um, how do we use identity to think about how we evaluate a source of information? Do we believe it? Do we accept it? Do we say this is the kind of thing that I'm definitely going to accept? Are we much more skeptical or rejecting of it? Do we use this to attack somebody or dismiss somebody? Um, what kind of person am I also affects adaptive decision making. Like, am I bound by these rules because I am this kind of person and therefore tied to this kind of community and will be judged by this set of norms within this group? I think identity is really a kind of category that is at the core of so much of our behavior and decision making.
Mm,
And just to say, like, all categories in general, like categorization is kind of one of the fundamental things that we do, right? That's foundational to how we behave and how we think, how we perceive the world. And I just think that identity is a really important social category that is more fleshed out and developed and nuanced in humans than in other species.
mm,
Do you view identity as identical to categories in that it serves the same function as a category? Like if I were to categorize, an animal, say birds, that's going to help me make predictions about a new bird that I haven't seen before. I'm going to assume that it flies, that it builds nests, or whatever, and that's a useful category for me because it helps me make predictions about new cases I haven't seen. Similarly, if I see a new fruit, I'm going to assume that it's sweet. And so these categories help structure our understanding of the world. Do you view identities as just the social version of that? It's just about helping us make better predictions about people and in what ways they're likely to behave, or is it something more than that?
Yeah, basically yes.
Okay.
I think of identity as a kind of category,
Okay.
and being a sort of special kind, it has the features that it has. Like the category identity is a kind of category that has certain features. But yeah, I do think that to me, the most helpful way to think about identity is as a kind of category.
mm.
Okay.
And David, well, let me just poke on that
Yeah.
too a little bit, which is that, but there's also the part, and Paul, this is also like what you study. So I'm just saying what you've said is that it would be also as if like the fruit was also in a strategic stance towards the world. So unlike the fruit case where we're talking about the third party perspective of, well, what can I make an inference about for this fruit? There's also this sort of entrepreneurial or creative part of identity or strategic part of identity, negotiating identities or creating them or embodying them or broadcasting them.
Right.
Hmm.
And I think that that's exactly right. And beyond that, it's not just that the fruit is, behaving, right? Other people are behaving. And so we have to think about strategic views on what, because due to their someone else's identity, how will they behave? But we also have to think about that they are another person with theory of mind who has, categories about identity of their own. And we're all making decisions with limited information. And so understanding that another person may have their own categories of identity. They may have categorized me in a way that I wouldn't categorize myself, or maybe I hope that they categorize me that is not necessarily entirely accurate, but it's useful strategically for them to categorize me in that way. And so I think the fact that you have lots of people categorizing each other in an interacting population makes is one of the things that makes identity so interesting.
Mm. And that would also explain then what I'm hearing you say is why, and this is like a very David Pinsoffian and Paul Smaldinian,
Small,
Smaldoni,
Whatever you go
Smaldonian,
with, just own it.
Yeah, I like it. Is that there's a lot of negotiation. Like one of the jobs in social status competition is to say, here are the identities, or let's try out if this we attribute this identity to you and act on behalf of this identity. Um,
That's right. And we often sort of we try on roles, we try on identities in different contexts, and we sort of see how they fit. And we modify how we view other people, and we modify how we present ourselves, um, at various times in our lives and also in different contexts. And so there are also like, yeah. So this is one of the things that I think is so interesting about identity because it's actually extreme. It's not one thing. It's actually very multifaceted. And we have aspects of our identity that are pretty permanent. We have aspects that are maybe, more malleable, but over longer time scales. I mean, part of our identity is like what age category we are in, right? Um, and then there is the ones that are very fluid and that change by context, like who we're with or what purpose we're in, what role we take. Maybe you're in a leadership role in like your, garage band that you go practice with, but you're actually in a subordinate role at work. And I think yeah, so we're really good at knowing what our role is in different contexts. And so I think this is one of the reasons it makes sense to think of identity as a kind of category.
Yeah.
Hmm.
One of the ways you study, or can you talk a little bit about how you study social identity? Because this is also a transition to sort of how you do your work, because, many listeners, they might not know how you approach topics. And so you can imagine somebody just sort of approaching the idea of identity and what you've just described with sort of paper and pencil surveys like a social psychologist, no offense to that. But, the way you approach any topic you study is with a bunch of cool tools that are, you're one of the people doing these things and writing books about them. So can you talk a little bit about like how do you approach these and why do you use that tool?
Sure, yeah. So I mean what you're talking about is modeling, right? Is mathematical and computational modeling. And I do those other things too a bit, like the behavioral experiments, because and it's important to actually see what people really do in like a lab setting, in a behavioral setting. It's also important to see what people do not in a lab setting, right? Which is why sort of field work and naturalistic observation are important. But so I mostly do modeling. The bulk of my work, I would say 80 to 90% of the work I do is building mathematical or computational models. Um, and I can talk more about how that works and what that is and et cetera. But part of it is like I think the world is really complicated. I mean I know that the world is really complicated.
Controversial
Yeah,
take.
right. It's a hot take.
It's just a few simple gizmos. Just you got your atoms, and they're all
Yeah, it's
just
Atoms in
buzzing around
time. Atoms in
the
time.
time.
Put that
Yeah.
on a t-shirt.
uh, yeah. So I think it's really hard to think about all the things, and we all have to make simplifications. And we like every single person makes simplifications in our just going about the world, right? Going about our day. You don't think about every single molecule of dirt or sand or pavement on the street. You don't worry about the wind or well, unless you do, right? Unless the thing is important for your decision making. So most of the things that, when we're walking around doing our thing, we ignore tons of stuff if they're not likely to be important about the decisions we need to make. And when we build experiments, we come up with some paradigm where people behave in some way and we try to get them to do something. And we're usually not like, oh, what I'm really mostly interested in is like how people sitting at a laptop will click, which one of these things at this time. Like that's the main thing I'm interested in. Behavioral experiments these days are increasingly online, or like fill out a survey or whatever. We're interested in what we try to do when we build experiments is capture some essence of the real question that we're interested in, whether it's about, identity or cognition or behavior or whatever it is. And that's limited. There's only so much you can do there. And it also leaves a lot of unexamined assumptions. And that's just the nature of the thing, right? When you deal with like a very complex system, you have to ignore a lot of it in order to get any tractability and do science, right? And actually like isolate a signal that is strong enough to give you a sort of this is going this way and not that way. Um, and as a supplement to that, which is sort of where I come in mostly, is trying to build sort of artificial systems, fake systems that capture the sort of essence of whatever dynamic that we're talking about, whatever the sort of components of the dynamic we're talking about, and think about the kinds of interactions, the properties that they have, and the way they interact and evolve over time, change over time. And sort of run that through mathematics or through computer simulation and sort of examine, okay, based on these assumptions I made, have the outcomes that I predicted really happened? Is there something that I didn't expect? Can I explain that? Um, that's a really powerful thing about modeling is I love it when something happens that you don't expect.
Mm.
And then because when something happens that you don't expect in the real world, you're like, it could be a million things. I don't know. Maybe I don't have enough data to figure out what it is. But with the model, you've built the thing. You know everything that went into it. So if something happens that you don't expect, the main tool you have now is your brain to think, okay, well, you know, based on what I've put in, why did this thing come out? And sometimes it's because you made a mistake. And sometimes it's because you assumed something that you thought didn't matter, but it turns out it mattered a lot.
Mm.
And sometimes it's because there were just unexpected consequences of what you did. The other really cool thing for me about doing these kinds of models are just the tremendous power to run variations and run lots of things. Like when we do experiments, you're so constrained by like how much money you have to pay participants or to go collect data or how much time a person is willing to sit and answer questions for, right? Or how many research assistants you can get to like run all the variants of your study or oh, it would actually be unethical to like kill a bunch of people or like poison them or like, release a disease into the world. Like we definitely can't do that experimentally and we wouldn't want to, but we would kind of sometimes want to know what would happen on, let's say, a really long time scale. That's really hard to study, especially when we're doing evolutionary thinking, right? It's like if you all you have is experiments, especially with humans, you mostly have at your tools, you have archaeology to look at the past and maybe some paleontology and history. And then you have, this snapshot of what's happening now. And you try to make these really complicated inferences about like, okay, well, how did what we see now come out of what we think we know about the past? And using simulations, we can sort of say, well, okay, well, if the past was like that, and if these sort of general principles of change and behavior apply the way we think they do, then we can kind of simulate forward in time and look at different variations. We can run these simulations thousands of times with basically the same things. We can randomize a bunch of starting conditions to try to get them to start over and over again. So I do this a lot. I really like it. one of the things, and I'm happy to talk a lot about this. I wrote a textbook on doing this kind of modeling, sort of a general social science um, approach, although it definitely has sort of an evolutionary flavor. And I don't know, I'm working actually on a second textbook that is more evolutionary in its approach
Cool.
explicitly. Um, but one of the things that I really like about this approach, in addition to I think math is cool, I think computers are cool, I think these help me learn, is I'm also just very kind of ADD in my interests. And it takes like a really long time to set up a lab or a field site. And I know this, I have friends and colleagues who do this kind of work, right? You yourself, Dave, right?
Yeah.
Like, it takes so long to get good experiments done.
Yeah. It's like making a movie as opposed to switching channels or well, channels, but like watching movies versus making movies. It's like making the setting up the lab is like making a movie. It's really
It,
slow.
yeah, it's a good analogy. And I think like, uh, instead of, you know, if I just wrote the movies,
Yeah.
and that's more like what I do,
Yeah.
which is like I know how, it works in theory, and I can just kind of like imagine it, except I can do more than imagine it and I can simulate it. But the once you sort of learn how to code and do these kinds of analyses, right? Like the startup time to getting simulations, the thing that takes the longest, honestly, is the design part, is just making sure that the model makes sense and is a good model. And I think that's the hardest thing to do. And but once you can do that, right, running simulations is pretty low cost.
Yeah.
Especially like if you're like me and are at a major university and you have access to a high performance computing cluster, you can run tens of thousands of simulations in a day. It's so funny to me when I talk to people who do simulations and they'll just say, "Well, I don't want to do that. Like that's too many simulations to run. It's going to take like a week to get all that data." And I'm like, "Are you kidding me? Like, do you know?"
Talk to an infant researcher or an
Exactly.
anthropologist. Yeah. A field
Yeah.
anthropologist. Yeah.
My wife has a PhD in developmental psychology,
Yeah.
and so like she did this like longitudinal work that for her dissertation that took a year and a half just to
Yeah.
collect all the data.
Yeah.
And yeah, a field anthropologist who's spending, months out of the year every year going back, over years to collect data for a single study. So I find it sort of laughable when people complain about it taking like a week to do data. And it's not even like you have to be there for that week. You just like hit run and then walk away.
Yeah.
Um, so the challenge really is, but the bar is then the standard becomes like, do you do something meaningful with it? Do you do something that makes sense, that is develops insight, right? Because otherwise it's like, what the fuck am I doing?
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So it might be useful to like um, take a concrete example of how this approach is used. So have you run simulations or developed models relating to identity that you could walk us through, like how you break apart the components? Or is there another model that you think is a good illustrative example of how this approach works?
Yeah, sure. I think, I mean, the answer is
Yeah.
yes to that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about, we can talk about the covert signaling stuff because
Okay.
I've done a lot on that.
Okay.
So, uh, this came out of an idea, basically, first of all, that context would influence the nature of identity if you think of identity not only as a category, but as a communicated piece of information that I I know things about myself. Am a certain way. I am affiliated with certain groups. I have certain commitments. And I meet you, a stranger, and I'm going to communicate certain things to you. And there's an old literature from anthropology mostly and sociology, social psychology have sort of worked on this too, on like ethnic markers or identity tags. It's like, well, if we live in a world where people are different from each other and they meet strangers, it would be good to have a way, sort of from a distance, at a safe distance, to be able to know very quickly some things about, what this person is likely to be, what this person is likely to be like. And so the way they dress, the way they, decorate themselves, that's obvious, right? Their fashion, their clothing, you can see that really far away. Then there are certain things like the way they move, certainly the way they talk, like obviously the way they use language, the language they speak, but also the accents they have, the mannerisms of their speech. These are things we can really easily use to categorize people. And this really helps. And it helps those kinds of ideas were really influential to me, but they're really kind of based on this idea of fairly small insular groups that where everyone in the group is an in-group member and works with each other, and everyone from another group is an out-group member and works with each other. And so we just want to know, like, if I meet somebody in the forest, are they a member of my sort of larger collective, let's say tribal group or identity group, or are they from, a different place or from a different, and if so, what kind of person are they? Are they a group that like we have relationships with? Are they someone that we're enemies with? I need to know. But now we live in really diverse societies where we're interacting constantly with people that we don't know, we've never met before, that nobody we know knows necessarily. Um, and we need to be able to make sort of rapid decisions about them because sometimes, like often, one of the things that really characterizes our, modern societies is we sort of behave cooperatively with strangers every day. It's just like you go to the store, buy things from the person at the store. You don't try to steal from the other customers, right? You like ride the bus or the train or get on a plane, right? Where we're all sort of calmly, right? Sarah Hardy has this famous example of like if you took like 200 chimpanzees and put them on an airplane in like a locked, cabin in the sky, like you would, by the time that plane landed, you'd have like a bunch of dead chimpanzees because they'd all have killed each other. Um,
Movie option idea.
Yeah.
yeah, chimps on a plane.
Yeah, Jim's on a plane.
I, yeah. I don't know about you guys. Every time I go to the grocery store, I form a coalition of males and I raid someone else's shopping cart.
I was gonna
So
say, I think
yeah,
David might be the exception to what Paul
yeah.
just
So
said. Yeah.
I'm an
Anyway,
exception
yeah,
to this rule.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, that's why I don't go to Ralph's. But
Yeah.
um, the part of the sort of so I had this initial idea that like the way that society was structured, about the ways this society was structured, and the sort of largeness and the diversity of the society would influence the sort of breadth versus depth trade-off in the way people signal their identity to each other, and the sort of nature of the context specificity of that. And that's an idea that I've held on to for quite a long time. I think I first started really thinking hard about that about maybe 10, 11 years ago, 12 years ago. Um, I really sort of I published like a sort of conceptual idea paper about it, shortly thereafter, and we just have like the first kind of major modeling paper on this idea coming out, hopefully coming out. We're just about to submit the final revisions soon, but and I'll talk more about that. But one idea that kind of came along with that I developed was this idea that we actually aren't just trying to honestly signal about ourselves. Um, it's actually a lot of the time we hide information. We're not only dishonest, but just sort of sneaky about, or selective, let's say, is the word, about how we talk about ourselves to other people. And that obviously we do that, right? We just like you don't walk into a store and just start like yelling your political beliefs, right? You use judgment, right? Prudence, right? You're being savvy. Um, but one of the things that's really interesting is what happens when you have a diverse society, and like often you find ourselves in positions, both like in person and certainly now online, where there's a large audience, multiple listeners. And the thing that occurs then is every person if you have people from diverse backgrounds with diverse experiences and assumptions and categories, if I say something that potentially gives information away about who I am, that's going to be interpreted differently by different people. I mean, the most simple version of that is like one person is like, great, they're like me. I might want to be friends with them. And another person is like, oh, they're part of that group that I hate. Like, I want to fight them or rob them or just like not help them or whatever. And what happens? How do I talk about myself? Or, well, first, a further version of that is like, what if, you know, if I'm a member, let's say, of an oppressed minority, I might want to talk about myself in a way that I need to find friends, I need to find people who will help me, I might need to find, romantic partners, but I don't want to risk outing myself in public and be potentially ostracized or hurt or imprisoned or killed. And so I need to be more selective about the way I speak. And one of the things that's really cool about human language, and not just human language in terms of spoken words, but also in terms of like the way that we communicate more broadly, is how nuanced, ambiguous, and multifaceted it is, right? There's the linguists have this term called implicature, which I really like, right? Which is me like the meaning that is implied by the statement, right? This comes from pragmatics. So if I glance at an open window and say, it's a little chilly in here, I don't have to say like the implicature is maybe you should close the window, even though I didn't say it explicitly. And what's neat is that because we because language is complicated, because we have enough life experience to draw on previous categories, we are smart enough to think about lots of things in different ways, context, etc. I can say one thing that will have different implicatures to different people. And when this is used strategically for identity signaling, this is what we call covert signaling. So this is work that I originally developed with Tom Flamson and Richard McElreath, and have continued to develop it with other colleagues. Um, this idea that you know I could signal overtly and just that's like, hey, this is who I am. Let me tell you very clearly, unambiguously, this is something that you want to know about me, right? Like I'm a gay socialist who loves football and, whatever, hates square dancing.
Hmm.
Um, and that's going to be really effective at making sure nobody is mistaken about who I am. And therefore, like, it's going to really, maximize the fact that the chance that people who are similar to me are going to know that they're similar to me and therefore, might want to extend relationships with me. On the other hand, though, if anyone is going to be turned off by that or enraged by that, that's going to be very bad for me. On the other hand, right, I could say something like, I really love this movie, or, I come in with a t-shirt that has an obscure reference, or just use jokes or fashion or other kinds of, sometimes we call them dog whistles, aspects of speech and communication that if you know what I'm talking about, if you are also aware of, that these clothes or that movie reference or whatever, if you know those things, that the people who are likely to know those things are also likely to be similar to me and less likely to be members of other groups. And therefore, people who are similar to me will catch those references, whereas the people who are different from me will miss them. Because language can have multiple implicatures, I could say something this is one of the reasons why, like, for most people who like humor, which is most people, right? Like, there's this old trope that like the funniest people are actually like your friends are the funniest people you know, always. Like the people who can make you laugh the most consistently are your friends, and there's like a very good reason for that, right? Like humor is an incredible tool for establishing that like we have shared values, shared references, and so I can make a joke and it will land really well with my friends who like were there at the thing that I'm referencing or, understand that that thing is funny in the way that I meant it. Whereas other people might just say, they might hear what I say, and it's not like I'm talking another language. They can hear the literal words I mean, but there's the text, right? And there's subtext. And subtext can act as this kind of covert signal. So that's the basic idea. And when we build these models, it's really helpful to start with a basic idea. This is what we call a verbal theory, what I've just talked about. It's an idea, it's talked about in words, it seems to make sense, and then we build models in order to do a few things. One is like develop a proof of concept. Like, okay, well, here's a way it could really work or might really work under certain assumptions. And here are also the boundary conditions. Here are sort of when it would or wouldn't work. And we can show how it would or wouldn't work. And we can even use this to make explicit predictions. At some case, if you have very good data and very good theory, you can even make explicit quantitative predictions. But a lot of these models uh, are used, at least initially, to develop more qualitative predictions. So some of the first modeling we did of this was to just sort of establish basically you create an artificial world where you say, okay, well, the world is going to be populated by people. What are the properties of those people? What do they do? Well, everyone has in these models some things about them. And to anyone else, to make things easier, we just said, well, let's just say any two pairs of people are either similar or not similar. And in a later model, we say, well, we can make explicit things. We give people like a vector of things about them, and we establish a cutoff where if you share enough things in common, you're similar, otherwise you're dissimilar. And you could do this if you think that's about assumption, you could do it you should do it another way. That's you've just identified one of the great things about modeling, which is that if I do modeling and I say, look, I've made this discovery with my model, you can say, well, you've made an assumption that doesn't hold in the systems that I'm interested in. And that's great. That means that you can take my model as a jumping off point and build on it and extend it and say, look, if you make these other assumptions, it doesn't hold. And that I think all goes towards building more robust, more falsifiable scientific theory. So we build these models and we assume that like basically people are in a population where there's other people in the population that are similar or dissimilar to them. And in these first models, we say, well, let's not even worry about what signals they're using or how they're signaling. Let's just assume that what they're doing is signaling either overtly or covertly. And overt signaling has a probability of, being identified by anyone who's around. And regardless if they're similar or dissimilar. And covert signaling is noisier, so even similar people are less likely to pick up on it. Sometimes you miss a joke even when your friend makes it. But dissimilar people are really unlikely to get it. And then it's this trade-off, right, between the increased fidelity of the overt signaling versus the avoiding sort of burning bridges with dissimilar individuals. And then we assume, well, okay, now people pair up to actually work on something together. And there are factors that influence the payoff that they get, how good that is, how good that working together is. Say, well, it's better to work with someone who's similar to you, but it's if you have to work with someone who's dissimilar to you, it's better not to be aware of all your differences. Right. So it's
Mm.
better, we all like, you can work with someone. It's why like, we have these heuristics of like don't talk about politics and religion at Thanksgiving or whatever, right? It's sometimes better not to highlight the differences in order to have a good time. And
Mm.
especially if you're trying to work with somebody. Um, And we can vary things like, well, how bad is it? Like, is it a little bad to know you're dissimilar, or is it like really bad, like they kill you? Um, and how often do you have to work with people who are different from you?
Mm.
Is it really easy to like if you can always use information that you have, your preferences about other people, and only choose people who you like and never have to work with people you don't like? Yeah, maybe you should signal overtly all the time. Uh, but if sometimes you have to work with people, a fair amount of time you have to work with people that you don't like, um, then yeah, the model sort of predicts that we should expect more covert signaling. Now, I'll take a pause here, but I'll just say like that was sort of the groundwork, this kind of modeling with these kinds of qualitative predictions from the math. And we did simulations later, both where we did an agent-based sort of computational model where we could have minority and majority groups to make more explicit predictions there. We did an experiment using sort of pre-Elon Musk Twitter to to look at how people were actually signaling about their political identities online in different contexts, and how people we did it in a behavioral experiment where to look at like what signals people chose to see if like the predictions of the model actually, aligned with how people act in the world, and they do. Um, and then, you know, later this, the work was sort of like I said, we in these models we said, well, we don't know. Let's be agnostic about what signals people are using, how they're using that, and even like, how they choose their signals. All it is a strategy of covert signaling or overt signaling. Um, but that led to sort of new ideas about the sort of lifespan of signals. Um, and the idea that like, well, if I'm using, let's say, a reference, a fashion choice, or some words that I'm using, a joke that I'm using, and I'm doing this in public, like the whole idea is like there are third-party listeners, and I'm using this because the people who are not like me don't know this reference, and the people who are like me do. Well, like people aren't stupid. Eventually, if everybody in my in-group is using these covert signals, people from the out groups are gonna wise up. They're gonna notice. Like we notice
Yeah.
all the time, right? This is something that's like
We call out the dog
we
whistles
call
as
out
a
the dog
group.
whistles,
Yeah.
usually often years after they were effective.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's sort of the nature of it. So something that used to be covert is now overt. And we became interested in what are the dynamics of like, does that imply that covert signals will have like a natural lifespan? How long is that lifespan? What would determine that lifespan? Um, and exactly how long the lifespan is, we don't know. But the things that determine the lifespan now we do know from we built a completely different kind of computational model and also a math model to do this. Covert signaling, I think also this is one of I'll pause for a second. I keep saying I'll pause and then not, but this is one of the additional benefits of modeling. It's not just that these things are hard to study because we're talking about timelines that are hard to study or and naturalistic interactions that are hard to study, but also because by definition, I'm talking about a signal, a piece of communication that you have to already be in the in group to be able to identify. And that's really hard to study empirically.
Mm.
We came up with some workarounds for a couple of different empirical studies, but they're limited, right? And the modeling really drove what we were looking for and helped us sort of see what kind of thing we were looking for.
Mm. Yeah. If it's designed to not be detected by the experimenter, then that makes the experimenter's job extremely difficult.
It does, yeah. So when we did this with Twitter data, and this is data collected in 2020. we specifically used, tweets collected in the like weeks right before the 2020 presidential election in the US. We only used US participants and US based accounts. And we figured, well, political identity was really salient. I don't know if you guys remember 2020 is a really fun year. Um, the it was like, you know, it was wait, was this 2020 or 2016? Now I can't remember. Um, Either way, it was like, this we're talking about like right before, the election, which was very heated. It was right around when Amy Coney Barrett had been approved to the United States Supreme Court. It was just months after George Floyd was murdered. So like political identity was super salient. And what we did was collect a bunch of tweets based on accounts that were following a fair number of either far right or far left news sites. So we're like, these people are probably going to be tweeting about politics. And then um, what we did was we got participants recruited through MTurk at the time, and we gave them a survey to determine their sort of where they fell on the political spectrum, not just left and right, but how far left and how far right. So we sort of group people into four categories: radical right, radical left, moderate left, and we then sort of gave people just lots and lots of tweets. And we said, all right, like, what do you think about this tweet? And, more importantly, like, what can you tell about the likely political identity of the person who tweeted this just based on the text? And we, blanked out the account name and the picture. So all they saw was the text of the tweet. And, sometimes it's really obvious, right? Like if someone was just like, fuck Trump, like that's probably not someone on the right. Uh, Whereas, there are other things that were a lot more subtle, like references to laws or, sort of dog whistles that people use internally with an in-group, but don't really use with the out-group. And we found that there were a number of tweets that reliably people on the same side of the spectrum as the tweeter on one side of the spectrum were like, yeah, 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 I know what this is. I like this. I'm in favor of this. Whereas people on the other side, especially the moderates, who are the majority, didn't get. That
Mm.
we had to sort
Hmm.
of adapt the theory a little bit, that we hadn't really thought about radicals and moderates in the modeling, but empirically, like it makes a lot of sense. Like the people who are really, on like very left or very right, they tend to also be sort of higher in their aggression and enmity for the other side, and they tend to be more savvy about the signals used by the other side.
Hmm. Interesting.
And yeah,
They have more of an
um,
incentive to detect the dog whistles than,
they
say, a
have
moderate would.
exactly. And I want to point out, like they are in the minority though. Like
Yeah.
it, way more people are moderates than are radical.
Mm.
I mean,
A
Oh,
question,
sure.
or
Yeah.
is it that the radical were better at detecting their same side dog whistles and the other side dog whistles, or what was the result?
so basically, if somebody is on the left and
Yeah.
sending a signal that like communicates a left sort of, biased message, everybody on the left understands that signal. If they're doing it covertly, the radicals on the right will also be fairly likely to
Mm.
notice it, but the
Got it.
moderates on the right won't.
Yeah, got it. They're like higher information and even higher information about the other side, in other
Yeah,
words. Yeah.
that's right.
Cool. Okay, yeah.
So we basically use this difference between the moderates. So anything where like moderates on both sides could immediately identify as a political signal, we were like, that's an overt message. And things that everyone on one side, but only the radicals on the other side recognized, we're like, that's probably covert.
Mm.
And um, in the, so we did two things there, right? And this is all sort of predictions that the whole design of this came out of the modeling that we had done.
Yeah.
Um, But we first just looked at like, what does it look like on Twitter? And again, this is before Musk took it over, so it was Twitter, not X. We just looked at the follower networks and sort of like who tweeted this, who's what are we looked at all their followers and the kinds of news sites that they followed. And we looked at, basically how partisan they were based on how mixed the partisan sources were. So if you
Mhm.
only followed right-wing sources, you were right-wing. If you only followed left-wing sources, you were left-wing.
Mhm.
If you followed both, you were more in the middle, and or at least more um, harder to tell. And um, and what we found is like the people who tweeted more overtly, most of their followers tended to be partisans on the same side of the spectrum. The people whose tweets were more covert tended to have more followers from both sides.
Mm.
And this is say radicals on either side. Radicals with politically homogenous audiences um, were more likely to signal overtly, and radicals with more distributed or politically distributed audiences were more likely to signal covertly. Is that
Not exactly. So
okay?
we didn't re we so the radical versus moderate, those were our raters, the people who were rating tweets after we'd collected them, because we could actually ask them all these questions
Mm.
about their political identity.
Got it.
The
Okay.
people who are actually producing the tweets, the only things we know about them are what news
Got
account
it.
they follow.
Got it.
So we're not really able to say that much about how radical they are, but we do know that
Right.
like they're probably at least fairly politically engaged because they're
Okay.
following lots of news sites and are tweeting about political things.
Got it. And
Right.
were the participants rating the radicalness or just the left-rightness?
So let me back up, right? So
Yeah.
we actually the first thing I did, right, or that we did was uh do some just ratings of tweets and ratings of so we got people to ask, answer questions just about their own political views, and that's how we could tell who they were. And then we asked them just to sort of rate these tweets that we had gotten, and we
Hmm.
used that to sort of as basically a metric, as an instrument to determine if the messages were being sent covertly or overtly.
Hmm.
And when we just looked at who's sending what kinds of messages online and who's following them, we looked at not so the people who are sending, let's say, right-wing tweets that are right-wing, they're
Hmm.
following lots of right-wing news sources. Who's following them? And what news sites are they of those people following?
Hmm.
If that person who's following lots of right-wing sites is tweeting out very overtly right-wing messages, that correlates with most of their followers also being people who mostly follow right-wing sites or
Hmm.
sources.
Got it.
If they're tweeting more covertly, that means that a larger proportion of their audience, their followers, are following left-wing sites, whether they're
Okay.
following both right or left or just left.
Got it.
That effect was, statistically significant, and it was,
Hmm.
as they say, but it wasn't huge because Twitter is already fairly homophilous. Like there's already a
Right.
fair amount of assortment on Twitter.
Yeah.
So to boost the signal for this effect, to test this, we did a behavioral experiment
Mm.
Hmm.
where we collected sets of tweets that were categorized as either left or right, overt or covert. So we
Hmm.
have four groups of tweets.
Hmm.
And then we bring a participant in. Now it's a new set of people. And we say, hey, um, you're going to rate a bunch of these tweets, just like we did before. And mostly we're just looking like we asked a few questions about them, like are they political, whatever. But also, like once we determined that they were political, do you like it or dislike it? Do you have positive or negative feelings toward the person who sent this? And so everyone did that, and then we said, now you're going to do an experiment. You're going to have a task where we're going to show you 40 tweets that are all, and we didn't tell them anything about the tweets, but actually, um, they were all from people from the same side of the political spectrum as them, and half of them were covert and half of them were overt. They didn't know which was which. We just said, you're just going to pick this, and we're just going to, and um, there's going to be a random set of 10 other people who are going to rate these tweets just like you rated them. And for every tweet that you select that most of your audience liked more than they disliked, you're going to get more money than we said we were originally going to give you.
Mm.
But for every tweet you pick that in this audience that if most of them or a majority of them dislike it, you're going to lose money. And so you be careful, but you can select as many or as few as you want. And we're like, there's a minimum amount you can get, but let's say, I don't remember what it was. It was like $5. If all of them hate it, if you pick all the tweets and all of your audience hates it, you might only get $2. But maybe if you go up, you can go like as many as $8. I don't remember the exact numbers. And uh, and all we told them about their audience was how many of the 10 were on the same side of the political spectrum as them. And, unsurprisingly, right? People are real. This is like in hindsight fairly obvious, but like, it was sort of a proof of concept. People are really good at this. Um, when when people knew that the majority of their audience was on the same side as them, they picked almost everything. They were like, all these, I agree with all these messages. I want to send them all to this audience. When people knew that the audience was made up of a fair number, like a mix, they were more careful. And when they knew that a lot of the audience, a majority of their audience was different from them, they were even more careful in two ways. They just selected way fewer tweets overall, and of the ones they selected, a higher percentage of them were covert. And so, like, it's artificial construction, but the idea was to sort of show that people actually do this in the real world, make these strategic considerations in the real world that align with the kinds of modeling that we did. And I think the conclusions that we make from the model are broader than the ones we can make from the experiment. But the experiment is just an illustration that yeah, people can behave in this way that we predicted that they would behave.
Hmm. I see an interesting extension of this. So it would be interesting to look at people who are on the same side politically, say left-wing people, um, and have them evaluate the political allegiances of the tweeter who is either tweeting a covert signal or an overt signal, and whether they think the people who are tweeting overt signals are more radical or more extreme than the people tweeting covert signals, even though they know, even in cases where they know the meaning of the covert signal. And so the idea there would be that if I'm sending an overt signal, I'm sending a costly signal of my loyalty to leftists because I am burning bridges with moderates and with right-wing people. Whereas if I have a more mixed social network, I can't afford to burn those bridges. And so I'm going to be unlikely to be as committed politically.
I think that's exactly right. And this is actually, yeah, what you're talking about is related to a lot of the conversations we were having as we first, started doing this kind of work. And one of the things that really kind of inspired, especially this experiment that I just talked about was, I had done the modeling and it just kept thinking about, I think the first paper was published in 2018, but it was written, the first draft of that paper was finished, I think sometime in 2015. And, something happened around 2015, 2016 in the US especially, right? All of a sudden it just felt like, and, we've been seeing it happen more and more, like all these kind of extreme white national racist, fascist sympathizers just started coming out of the woodwork. Like all of a sudden, they just there were more and more of them. Like people were on Stormfront, which is like a right-wing kind of fascist Nazi website, and they were just we had that march in Charlottesville, um, and it became very clear, like, why is this happening? Or the, question arose, like, why is this happening? And two possibilities sort of immediately present themselves. Like one, people have been recruited to this cause that weren't previously of this mindset. But all of a sudden, this has become much more attractive for people, and people, it's much more compelling. And a lot of people who previously didn't think this way now think this way. Another hypothesis, though, is that people there had been for quite some time a lot of people who felt this way, but were much more quiet about it. That maybe they talk this way in their insular social networks, but they would never talk this way among, in public because of the negative consequences. And between the kind of assortment that the internet and social media facilitate, so it becomes much more easy to find networks of like-minded people online, and that has, good things and bad things about it. And, the rise of a political leader, specifically Donald Trump and others who seemed ideologically aligned with these, sort of emboldened people and said, I think their perceptions of both their social networks and the potential payoffs, costs, and benefits of signaling changed. And so they went from signaling either only in private or covertly in public to being much more emboldened to signal overtly. And that was really where the idea came from. And the initial plan to do this study was much more ambitious, but it turned out to be really hard. So we did the smaller version of it. Um,
Right. I mean, it's occurring to me that another interesting extension of this would be to look at perceptions of group formidability. And you might expect that groups that are signaling overtly will be perceived as more formidable or more of a political threat, and perhaps even, larger in number than groups that are signaling covertly. Because if I have a huge social network of like-minded peers, I can afford to burn bridges with everyone else. I can afford to signal overtly. But if I'm a tiny minority, let's say, I'm a minority of dissidents in a totalitarian regime. I have to signal very, very, very covertly because if I get detected, off to the gulags I go, right? But if I'm in the majority, I can afford to signal as overtly as I want, without care for, burning bridges because there are so few bridges to burn or they're not very valuable bridges in the first place. And so
right.
it might be that if I'm looking, even if I know with certainty the political allegiances of the person, if they're signaling overtly, I'm going to be more threatened and estimate that they have a more homogeneous social network. They have a larger social network of like-minded peers than if they're signaling covertly.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
And would it also, I mean, the other question would be the same side. So if I'm a persecuted minority, for example, and I see somebody else explicitly, overtly signaling, that should be minimally interesting to me and maybe a little bit positive, if not really positive, because it's doing two things. One is it's sort of they're the canary in the coal mine. So are they going to go to the gulag or not? Because it tells me, how many other people like me are there. But then it also is maybe my group is more formidable than I thought. And maybe I don't have to signal covertly. So you can imagine that there's also an appetite for overt signaling of your own side when you're experiencing at some level in your brain that you're having to do it covertly for the time being.
Yeah, that's right. And this is actually something I'm super interested in because I think it's really hard to explain from a kind of strategic perspective. But I think, which is the sort of like, especially in political situations, when dissidents kind of go above and beyond, like they're oppressed. And if they signal in a particular way, they're going to be oppressed more, but
Yeah.
they choose to do it anyway in a kind of
Yeah.
act of defiance. I find this really interesting and inspiring in a lot of ways. And, I think. we can make kind of just so stories about, or speculate about that a lot of these people, and I think the evidence at least partially supports this, that like a lot of these people are like the ones who feel like there is no hope
Yeah.
in the mainstream system. There's this uh Benoit de Corson, I think, is Dan Nettle the other author. They have these papers uh on the on risk, and there are other people who've written about this too, but basically like risk and thresholds,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and how like people who are sort of just above the threshold where like you have every things are going okay for you as long as you don't rock the boat. Like you'll be fine as long as
Yeah.
you don't rock the boat. Those people are incentivized to not take any risks, to be very careful. But the people who've fallen below that threshold were basically fucked either way. Like, if they keep going on the way they've always been going, they've got nothing anyway. So they might as well try and take a chance.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that's also underappreciated is like those people can form coalitions
Yeah.
and raise themselves up out of that gulf explicitly by taking these risks and by sort of going against the mainstream. One of my favorite books that I read in the last number of years was this book called "Burning Down the House." Do you know
Mm.
this, Dave?
I know the song, but
Yeah, not the Talking Head song, which is
yeah.
great, but it's House spelled in the German way,
Oh,
Haus.
oh, nice.
And the subtitle is Punk Rock Revolution and the Fall of the Berlin Wall.
Oh, nice. I
And
should read that. Yeah.
it's written by this journalist, Tim Moore, and it's about basically punk rockers in East Germany in the 1980s and kind of highlighting these people. Like it just makes like the sort of American punk scene around the same time feel just completely like a bunch of posers because
Suburban.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's totally suburban, right?
Yeah.
It was
No,
like
no risk,
these
no
German
actual
punks were
risk. Yeah.
being like
Yeah.
arrested
Yeah.
by the Stasi
Yeah. By
and
the
thrown
G.
in
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
jail, and yeah, getting beaten up, getting literally thrown in prison, not being able to get jobs. The bands weren't actually allowed to play in public because you needed a permit given by the government to play
Mm.
punk rock. So you had all the shows were underground or in churches. But Tim Moore argues that basically, there was an effect of these people sort of actively resisting, and you can't help but notice them on the street. And when you see them continuously getting harassed and oppressed, despite not having done anything, he argues that this helped sort of turn the tide against the GDP or the DDR, sorry,
Yeah.
in East Germany.
Yeah, that's awesome. It also reminds me of Michael Moncrief we had on, and he was talking about drag queens, and it was a similar thing where it was,
Yeah.
1950s, and it was these guys who were down and out, low status. So it was exactly this. They're kind of screwed either way, and they're using this high variance strategy to help their own status, but then they're doing this work to push on and provoke, for reaction basically, and it was
Yeah, that's
dangerous to
right.
do this. Yeah.
If there's did you ever there's Hunter Thompson's first book, Hell's Angels, is
Yeah, that's a great
uh,
book. I love
it's a
Hunter
great
Thompson's
book.
great author. Good if you want to
Yeah,
be a better author or writer. Read good writers, and Hunter S. Thompson's great. Yeah,
yeah, agreed. Yeah, Hell's Angels is really great. I mean, he talks about them too in that book, like not in this kind of romantic way, but he's like, these are the dregs. This is
yeah,
the people who have nothing in society who are, and they've banded together to sort of form this outlaw group. And um, this kind of thinking has gotten, I've become more and more interested in this kind of dynamic between mainstream society and groups, kind of at the edges. Um,
yeah. It's super cool. I think one of the things I want to ask, speaking of groups at the edges, is science. And you have this paper with Richard McElrath about the natural selection of bad science. And there's two things I just want to preface for the audience to say. One is that everything you've been talking about, I think it's really important, and I want to be explicit about, is that I think the work you're doing is part of a movement to recognize that there are unintended consequences. So I think like a simple model of the world is sort of like what people intend is what happens. But I think the reason to do modeling or study social dynamics and is to say, look, selection, what you select for is what you get.
Yes.
Intentions be damned. And so I think that's really important. And I think that in the same way this applies to social identities, you've done work, like kind of meta science work about how do intentions versus selection. So, like, what are we selecting for example, when we do science? And might it be that there's unintended consequences that even things that seem good or nobody's with malicious intent or everybody's just sort of trying to get by in the aggregate produce these bad dynamics. I think that idea is really powerful, and I don't think outside of maybe the modeling work or the modeling world, I think there not everybody fully appreciates that. And so I want to just say, like, I think what you're doing is really important. Can you talk a little bit about um, the natural selection of bad science?
Yeah. Thanks for that. So, I mean, first of all, I'll just say, like, I think what you said is spot on and really important. And I think that, you know, it's a naive view, right? If people think that they can understand social behavior, the way that people behave, and almost all behavior is social behavior to some extent, um, when you're talking about humans, by only studying how individuals behave in kind of isolation, right? Like the lots of people interacting in a, cultural and social context over time produces behaviors that are direct consequences of the organization, the way those things, which is, more like sort of sociological thinking that, um, and I think that's really important. So, okay. Um, so the natural selection of bad science was this paper, this project that kind of came out a little bit about, Richard and I, this was a long time ago. We started working on this. Um, 2014, 2015. The paper came out in 2016. And I think the context is important then because you guys may recall, like this was kind of right in the aftermath of what's sometimes called the replication crisis. Which was really kind of started in psychology as being recognized, but gradually people noticed it in other fields, biomedicine, and lots of fields. Which was basically that a lot of the standard methods that had become standard in a bunch of these fields were producing results that didn't replicate. And it all like the one of the main catalysts, it wasn't the only one, but one of the main catalysts that really kind of launched this investigation was this publication in this top journal in social psychology by Darrell Bem.
Daryl Bem, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, he claimed to have evidence for seeing the future, predicting the future, that undergraduates could choose which curtain had a pornographic image behind it. And it wasn't even a real curtain, it was like a computer screen. And the point was like the computer chose which curtain to put the image behind after the students had made their guess. So there was literally no way for the students to guess. And yet he's like, well, it was actually they guessed correctly like 53% of the time. And, we did a t-test and found that that was statistically significant. And it's just ludicrously terrible methodology. It's just the thinking. And I got really upset for another reason too about it, or kind of was up in arms about it, because I was like, this is a physics result. If you're claiming to like have evidence that everything we know about causality is wrong, like
Yeah,
that
there's
we've
another yeah substance in the
right,
world. Yeah,
this is like the
exactly. Yeah.
foundation of everything we do. This is a massive claim. and your evidence is just like, like a like 20 undergraduates clicked a button in slightly above chance. And, when people started investigating, they found that like actually he had showed them a whole bunch of different kinds of images, and pornographic images were the only ones that had a high enough. So it's like the whole like there's this XKCD comic about where like he's joking about scientists giving people different colored jelly beans and see if any of them will cure cancer. And then you try all the different colors, and
Yeah.
then finally one of them is like, oh yeah, like fewer people who had green jelly beans have cancer.
Yeah.
And then like the headline is like green jelly beans cure cancer.
Yeah.
But it's, if you try a million things, like statistically, one of them will have a correlation. But it's like there's that website, Spurious Correlations, where
Yeah.
it's just amazing, and everyone should look at it. It's like the number of like Kevin Bacon movies in a given decade correlates with like deaths by drowning. Uh,
Mm.
I mean,
Yeah. That
tremors.
one is actually causal, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
I can understand how seeing Kevin Bacon would make you less careful around bodies of water.
Ca-
I
Yeah.
I agree with that. I
Can I
agree with
can
Yeah.
I interject too? This is like inside scoop information. I, as a graduate student, submitted a paper to that journal, and the same action editor, they handled the BEM article, and my paper was rejected. And it was like careful, it was sort of an obvious thing. It was like accents are categorized. They had tons of control conditions, and it was not accepted at the same time that the BEM paper was. So it's also for me like very egregious in that it's also it wasn't just sort of like people were doing collecting careful science and then this just kind of got in. It was just, from my experience, it was obviously careful science was just being like, no, this is nonsense. And then ESP, yeah, come on in. Yeah.
Yeah, it
No,
seems like it's the opposite of what you'd want to be doing as a knowledge accumulating enterprise, which is taking into account past knowledge and trying to integrate new knowledge with the past edifice of knowledge, and coming into your hypothesis with a set of well-informed priors based on prior research and prior knowledge, as opposed to just starting your investigation in a vacuum, completely in ignorance of centuries of scientific research. And that's, I think, what we are all about as evolutionary social scientists is we want to integrate our knowledge of human beings with past knowledge that we've already accumulated about how evolution works, right?
right.
And the fact that social science does not avail itself of that tremendously useful tool of using everything we know to inform our research is just mind-boggling. But anyway,
Perhaps
continue.
Paul has a reason why people do
Yes.
this.
Yeah.
Why do
So
people do that? Yes.
yeah, so I agree. And yeah,
Yeah.
so part of this project was to sort of maybe highlight a potential reason for why people are not as good scientists as they should be or could be. Which was basically, griping about like various things in academia kind of came out of it. And seeing, these headlines, exactly the kind of thing you're talking about, Dave, like, yeah, these ridiculous studies getting, highlighted, put into, top journals and by people at Ivy League universities, while this like very careful, methodical, creative research was getting passed over or shunted or into lower, ranked journals. And um, you know, one of the things that's true about academics and scientists is that they're human beings and they live in a world, that is characterized. We live in an unequal, hierarchical society where having wealth and acclaim and prestige gives you higher, gives you, people certain kinds of satisfaction. It's things that people want. And it's also the case that not everyone can get those things, which, you know, immediately anyone who thinks about evolution to think, well, okay, scientists vary, they're different from each other. Um, there's something that, allows for the transmission of scientific knowledge where, scientists train other scientists via universities and postdoctoral fellowships and training. So there's inheritance in that way. And there's selection, right? So not only, so these are all the ingredients you need for an evolutionary dynamic. And the question then is, well, what ways do they vary? And especially, how are they selected? And so we built a model because the truth is they vary in lots of ways and they're selected in lots of ways. But we wanted to focus on the quality or rigor of the methodology. So we imagined, we created a model where we actually did a previous model where we had a population model of hypotheses. I like this paper a lot, and it's often overlooked. So this Richard and I did this previous paper where we looked at just a population of hypotheses that, where they were tested with certain amounts of error for both false negatives and false positives, and there were certain kinds of communication bias, like publication bias, and certain kinds of replication strategies. And we looked at, all right, well, like under different assumptions, what would we be able to say about the probability that a hypothesis is true given a certain record of supporting and non-supporting results in the published record? And so we had that model done. And we started thinking, well, that model just said like, well, there's an error rate. There is a power, a statistical power, the ability to find true results and avoid false negatives. What if we created a population of artificial science agents that varied in their methods? We said, well, okay, well, everyone has we just said, all right, all the agents have some sort of intrinsic methods that can vary in how rigorous they are and how powerful they are. And those things trade off. So we can avoid false positives um, by being extremely careful, but then we might miss a lot of true positives. We can find all the true positives by having very high power, by, saying everything is true. That would be good, but that's not good because then we get a lot of false positives. So we want to be able to say the things that are true and the things that are false. And to do that takes time and effort. It's being careful. But that means that, you're less likely to submit, to get false positives, which gives you fewer things to submit to journals. And it's going to take you longer between studies. And so that's actually the kind of science that we think we want, which is careful science where the things we say are true are actually true. But then there's the selection pressure. And in this case, we did a simplified version. So in reality, right, the reason why scientists get hired and promoted and get grant funding, which allows them to, train more graduate students, undergraduates, allows them to get more prestigious jobs where they have more influence. It comes down to a lot of things, but some of the biggest ones will be how many papers they publish, how prestigious and influential those papers are, how much grant money they get, etc. And in the model, we just distilled this down to one thing, which is just how many papers you publish. And we could build a model with other things, but in this simple version, we did it this way. And we also allowed for replication. So we said, all right, if somebody else replicates your study and it doesn't replicate, that's bad for you, and that hurts your prestige. But otherwise, the more papers you publish, the more prestige you have. And the more prestige you have, the more likely you are to transmit your methods to someone else in the future because you get a good job at a prestigious university, you get lots of grant funding, your papers are influential and people apply to work with you, etc. And we just kind of simulated this dynamic over sort of generations of scientists and showed that if the major selection pressure is how many papers you publish, all things equal, that's going to select for a continual decrease in the rigor that we see. Now, it's a model, and like I said, there are other things. But if it's wrong, right? Then we should see the opposite happening, right? Because what we actually want is things to be true. So we should see a gradual trend for better and better methods over time. If selection is actually favoring methods that are geared at improving truth, that have, evidence that they will actually help us get epistemic value out of our studies. But, there's a lot of evidence from a number of fields that that hasn't happened. Right? I mean, two of the ones I like to highlight is like, you know, there's this famous paper by Paul Meehl, who's a philosopher of science in the 1960s. He wrote this paper in the 1960s basically saying, hey, psychologists are really not using p-values correctly, this sort of null hypothesis significance testing. You're doing it really badly. You don't understand what p-values are. A p-value is not the probability that your hypothesis is true, and it's not the probability that the null hypothesis is false. It's actually just the probability that you saw the data you saw conditional on the null hypothesis being true. But that doesn't actually support any other specific hypothesis. And you would think that, in the 1960s, that was, 60 years ago, that would have an effect. But just less than a decade ago, the American Statistical Association published this like statement on p-values, just reiterating all the same things that Paul Meehl says. He's like, nobody, we did a survey, people don't understand p-values, they're not using statistics correctly. Well, why do you think that is? Well, understanding statistics is hard. It takes a lot of time when you could be running studies. And if you really understand statistics, you're going to be a lot more qualified in how you promote the results you got. You're going to be a lot more cautious. Whereas if you don't, you might just say, look, we found this amazing thing. Green jelly beans cure cancer. And that's going to get attention. And in a world where there's not good vetting of these kinds of results, where scientists are policing themselves, you can actually get selection for misunderstanding.
Hmm. Is this, would you view this analogously to life history theory, where there are trade-offs between quantity versus quality of offspring? You could either invest very intensively in a small number of offspring, if they're, if you expect them to live a long time, versus if you are in a high predation environment where most of your offspring are expected to die, you might want to hedge your bets and have a large number of offspring lay a bunch of different eggs in hopes that, and invest very little in any of them in hopes that at least a few of them will survive. Would you view this trade-off between quantity and quality as analogous to the trade-off between quantity and quality in scientific research?
I think loosely analogous. Yeah. I mean, to some extent, first of all, like, I mean, all evolution, right, is about trade-offs.
Right.
So anything evolutionary is going to be about trade-offs. But I think even more so, right, this is an interesting analogy because um, in a lot of scientific fields, people get, the jobs and fellowships that junior scientists get right out of graduate school or even during graduate school matter a lot. Um,
Yeah.
there was a really neat study about a decade ago by this Dutch group, and they looked at the people who got this very prestigious funding award. So it gives you a lot of money to do your research. It's also very prestigious, helps you get jobs. And they looked at basically the people who were ranked just below the threshold and just above the thresholds. The people who got the award, but barely, versus the people who barely missed out on the award. And then they tracked them for a number of years after, and their paths diverge wildly. There's a huge effect of
Hmm.
these early successes.
Hmm.
So the value of edging past, being perceived as edging past your peers early on is it ends up in our system being really high in a lot of fields. And
Yeah.
so if you take on as a graduate student a very complicated project that's you're spending, being very rigorous, very careful about and taking a lot of time and doesn't really lead to a lot of publications. Maybe a couple of like smaller publications that are you're publishing kind of on the way to something big. It's not big yet, but maybe it will be amazing later on. Versus somebody who's just cranking out those studies and
Yeah.
trying and aiming for things that are the sort of the most catchy and
Yeah.
most newsworthy and are the least careful. And what's going to happen, right, is if you have a system that values that second person over the first one, and it's not every system, not every field is like this, but when it is like that, then that first person doesn't get a job. They either get a low-ranked job where they're not going to have as many resources to continue doing their work, or they're going to leave academia and do something else.
Yeah.
And so the science that gets done overall um, gets worse. And this is actually why I think it's so important to think about the sort of cultural and institutional incentives and not just individual behavior. Like we all know about perverse incentives, but there are some people who think, well, look, you just have to be better than that. You just have to be better than that. You just have to do the work that you know is good. And
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, well, that sounds really noble.
Yeah.
Um, and let's imagine, you do and you feel really satisfied.
Yeah.
Maybe you get lucky, but if you take, 100 people like that and 100 people who are just, playing the system in the using the techniques that the system selects for, well, the system is going to select for those people.
Yes.
And so it can't just be about individual behavior. It has to be also about, the sort of cultural and institutional incentives, the mechanisms that select for certain people. I mean,
Yeah.
we didn't think about this at the time. I completely wasn't turned on to it back then, but I mean, this is very similar to what, Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman were talking about in Manufacturing Consent on their book on the media in the 1980s. This is also a kind of sort of institutional selection where they're
Yeah.
saying, you know, the people who are in control of, media organizations are hiring people and promoting people who espouse certain views and, think about things in certain ways and not hiring others. And even if every single person who goes into journalism is completely noble and thinks they're doing the best they can, the people who think along the party lines are going to be the ones that end up in positions of authority and influence, and the ones who think
Yeah.
differently are not.
Yeah, it's or that it's the whatever will be an audience, whatever increases the A/B testing of like what gets more eyeballs on this so we can sell
Yeah.
more ads. So yeah, if it's yeah, the idea that selection is what matters and not intention. I think
Hmm.
politics too, right? Like you can
Definitely.
you could say, um, how do we minimize crime? Well, we should do things that like punish criminals, right? As opposed to like, a minimal standard wage or something like Dan Nettles suggesting. The idea
Yeah.
that you can't intuit intentionally what will produce the outcome you want, and you have to just rely on the idea that there's selection, I think is a really humbling thing. And I think your work, when I've read it, every time I do something, I think to myself, like honestly, like I often think of the natural selection of bad science work, where I'm like, what am I selecting by clicking on this? Or what are we selecting if we make a decision about who to hire based on this criteria? How are we contributing? How are we like a cog in the wheel of the institution?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's even, I mean, I feel like this might even be a case of mismatch where we overestimate the effectiveness of appeals to morality and conscience. That if we just scold our way to better science or wag our finger to better
Mm,
science, that's going to solve the problem. We just need to encourage people to have integrity and to do better. Well, the problem with that view is that the people who are most susceptible to those appeals to conscience are going to be selected against under the
exactly.
current
Yeah,
incentive
that's right.
structure, and the people
So,
who are least susceptible to those appeals are going to rise to the top, right?
yeah, so you end
Uh,
up, if you
Yeah,
want is a world where integrity and, morality, let's say, are favored, you
yeah,
actually have to change the system so that the people who act that way are actually the ones that rise to the top and are the
yes,
ones that get rewarded, and the
yeah,
other ones get don't. And I think, I mean, with politics, I mean, obviously, we're seeing the effects of selection, every day right now. But I mean, even just at the most basic level, we have an electoral system with in the US, this like long drawn out kind of very media based um, electoral system where people run for office over months And what does that do, right? It selects for the people who are really good at running for office. But the people who are really good at running for office in that system aren't necessarily the people who are really good at governing.
Right. Yeah. Or even like, gerrymandering, or, it's even
Oh
worse,
yeah,
like the
those two.
selection. I mean, yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, like yeah, you would,
Right.
yeah, exactly. The selection, or even, yeah, yeah, tons of examples of, if you can put your thumb on the scale of the selection process, it's really leads to crazy outcomes.
Yes, it's a counterintuitive, like we're not inclined to view things in terms of incentive structure problems as opposed to character or ethical
Yeah.
problems.
Yeah.
I again, it may be a kind of mismatch. I don't know,
Yeah.
but it seems like our first inclination is we got to boo the bad people. We got to figure out who the bad people are and discourage them, and we got to praise the good people, and that's the way to solve the problem, as opposed to viewing it as an incentive-based problem that we.
Yeah, although I do want to maybe push back on that slightly
Sure.
because if it becomes normative to boo the bad people and punish the bad people, and the mechanisms for bad people succeeding are not there, right,
Yeah.
Yeah.
or are shut down actively, that does change it into a selective system.
Sure.
So,
Yeah.
so booing the bad people can be a precursor, or let's say an early, sign of
Yeah.
more normative, more institutionalized change. But you have to get all the way there, right? It
Yeah.
just can't be yelling from the bleachers.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I feel I just to interrupt, like I can't emphasize enough. I wish like we don't have ads on this, but like the PSA of like selection and not intention is really
Yeah.
what matters. I feel
Yeah.
like that's such an important sort of public uh education thing. Like I wish there
Mhm.
was something in school even where, I don't know, like just game theory models or something. I don't know what
Yeah.
you do with that, but just the idea. I think I even for myself, I still catch myself going in the wrong direction as David's talking about, where I just sort of really overemphasize people's intentions and motivations, or wagging a finger, as opposed to people are doing what makes sense given the incentive structure of the environment. And that's the thing you got to really target. I mean, it's hard because it's a bigger than one person.
It's hard, and it's not all one or all the other either. I
Yeah,
mean,
no, no, that's fair. Yeah.
Right.
Like,
especially
There
like, yeah.
right. And the problem is there are also incentive structures for changing the incentive structure, and those can be
yeah,
fucked too.
exactly.
And that's the problem,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
Like the people who rise to positions of power who are capable of changing the incentive structure, well, that is itself a whole selection process that you're not getting the people who are best able to do that.
yeah. No
Uh,
one wants to change the incentive structure to be something that wouldn't have selected for them.
correct.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
Paul,
which is yeah.
yeah, no, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, we saw that in science too, with a lot of pushback against reform a decade ago, where a lot of people who had succeeded very well, with the old system were very against these sort of
Yes.
increased scrutiny.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
Yes,
I
I
just,
remember. I mean, I was in grad school during the whole when the replication crisis was like reaching its peak, and I remember there was a lot of like political squabbles between the old guard. We're saying everything's fine. This is just a bunch of bullshit. These are like replication bullies, replication police, or whatever. And like the new guard was like, no, this is a serious problem. We need to really change things. And it was not a coincidence that the old guard, the people who were fighting for the status quo, were the people who were the most privileged, the most prestigious, with the highest positions in the current system. They were obviously the stakeholders of the status quo, and the new guard were the people who were most likely to benefit from a new system. Um,
collapse
so
of a
yeah, it
status game. Yeah. Collapse of your stat
exactly.
in David Pinsoffian terms. Yeah.
Exactly. I was in the middle of a status game that was on the brink of collapse, and there were stakeholders in the current status game that were trying to preserve it, and stakeholders in a new status game that were trying to undermine it. And I think, things have improved. I mean, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, but I think we have at least seen some progress. I would like to see more, but I think we're certainly better than we were in the peak of the replication crisis. Would you disagree with that?
well, yeah, yes and no. I think that yes, I think there are a lot of things that are better. Um, I think that the people are a lot more savvy about statistics than they were and methodological design. Um, I think people are generally, graduate students coming out of the social sciences and psychology are better at coding and better at statistics. They're increasingly thinking about causality. Um, I still think that the sort of like minutiae, like myopic view of, I will do one study that changes the world and without really thinking about how it is linked to the larger, you know, uh, constellation or blanket of human behavior, the breadth of human behavior. I think that's still missing a lot of the time, and it leads to a lot of work that I feel like could be good if there was some more thought that went into it. But I've been disappointed in a lot of the work that's come out, and maybe this is just there's an old adage that 90% of everything is crap, and maybe that's just always true. Uh, but I think like that, the good 10% uh, is pretty good. Now, there's a lot of good stuff.
The
Yeah.
main point of progress I've seen is that you can now get more status for a failed replication attempt than you could have in the old era. Now, if I fail to replicate someone else's work, I could get that published, and I could get some attention for that. It
That's
used to
great.
be that if you failed to replicate someone's work, no one would pay attention and no one would care. So that I think is at least some progress.
Yeah. It's an improvement.
Um, the
Yeah.
the thing that I haven't seen as much progress as I would like is in terms of theory.
Yeah. I
And
was gonna say, yeah, yeah.
and the people think of theory as like an airy, superfluous thing, but it actually feeds directly into your model, which is that if you have an incentive structure where you are ignoring past knowledge and you are preferentially seeking out low prior hypotheses, and the lower prior your hypothesis, uh, uh, if it pans out, the higher your status. Well, that is going to further exacerbate the trend. So if I'm hunting for counterintuitive findings that clash with everything we have known in the past, and I get more prestige if my finding is more shocking and more titillating, well, that is a recipe for even worse science and even less replicable work. Because if I'm pumping out lots of different studies looking for the low prior hypothesis, well, chances are one of them is going to turn out to be right. And if I publish that, I'm going to get tons of status for discovering this new flashy counterintuitive thing, right? But if we're all in a different incentive structure where instead of hunting for the lowest prior hypotheses, we're hunting for the highest prior hypotheses, well, then all of a sudden the dynamics are different. If we have a theoretical edifice that is causing us to preferentially look for data that is more likely to be confirmed and hypotheses that are more likely to bear fruit, that is going to help the replication crisis much more because any given finding is just going to be more likely to replicate because it has a prior edifice of knowledge behind it. I don't know. What do you think about that way of thinking?
I I understand that way of thinking, but I
Yeah.
also think that there's a problem that potentially comes out of it, which is that we we want to the things that are counterintuitive or surprising, let's say, are actually the more valuable if they're right. Right? So,
Yeah.
if I tell you that like, hey, I dropped 1,000 pennies and all of them fell down, like that's not a interesting like yeah, I can replicate that, but like no one cares, right? We know it's gonna happen.
Yeah.
Uh if I tell you that like I discovered a material that actually goes up when you drop it and we never knew about it before, that's amazing. I mean, it's just a helium balloon, right? But like
It
if
still
it's
seems
not,
amazing. It's amazing still
yeah,
to me.
helium
Yeah.
balloons are
I
incredible.
I
They're the
don't
best.
don't
Yeah.
poo-poo helium balloons. They're amazing. It's magic.
Right? Things, things that are counterintuitive, they're surprising. We pay attention to surprising things for like a very good evolutionary reason, right? That it has
Yeah.
information.
Yeah.
And the issue, right, is like if every single person individually is looking for the most surprising thing because individuals get rewarded when they find something really surprising, well, everyone's going to try to like find something regardless, especially if some of these other incentives are also in place and people are not looking for things with good reason. They're just kind of, if you find something surprising and it's true and it's real, that's
Yeah.
valuable.
Yeah.
But if you find something that you say is surprising, but actually, if you think about it for a minute, it's like it's not. It's only surprising because like you've been like really myopically and your field has been myopically looking in one place. Um, Another area of research I've been getting more and more interested in is the sort of like collective intelligence, collective problem solving stuff. And, if we stop thinking about scientists as a bunch of individuals that all are individually incentivized to be the individually best scientist, but think about, teams and collectives as what would be the best strategy if we have aligned interests that we're all trying to find good stuff. Well, to some extent, it would be to get it wouldn't be to have every single person working on exactly the same problem.
Yeah.
You would want an, just enough idiosyncrasy, enough, iconoclasts that people are looking in different places, that people are trying things that might not work,
Yeah.
and they're not punished for failing as long as they're doing it well, as long as they're being rigorous and careful in the way that they're doing it. And if you have people if what's being, sort of scrutinized is this a good idea and is the way you're doing it good, then let people do all kinds of things. And if we can evaluate the methods, but, and the methods can include the method of selecting a hypothesis,
Yeah.
it's tricky because evaluation is by its very nature a variance reducing process.
Yeah.
And variance reducing is good if you want to maintain high quality that's corresponds to a fixed set of criteria. But, as we know well, right, evolution works on two things, right? Selection and variance. And, it's the fundamental theorem of evolution, right, is that the speed of evolution is proportional to variance in the population. So higher variance actually makes a population more adaptable and more resilient. So we
Yeah.
also need mechanisms to inject variation into the
Yes.
system if we want it to be, to be making progress. So
Yeah. No. Yeah, no, I agree with that. Yeah, no, it's analogous to like if I have a stock portfolio and I want to invest in a bunch of different stocks and I want to ideally invest in stocks that are likely to give me a return, but maybe I'll take a risk, in a few cases. Maybe I'll include a few risky stocks in my portfolio too, and that's probably a good thing, right? And the same thing is true of science. We want to invest in theories and ideas that are likely to bear fruit, but maybe a small percentage of us can take some risks on some wilder ideas, and we'll see what happens. But I think the current distribution is lopsided, where we have too many people investing in the risky strategy and not enough incentive for figuring out when those risky findings are actually correct or not, and not enough people investing in the more promising ideas. And we get a lopsided distribution of research. Ideally, we would have uh, you know projects that have some high likelihood of bearing fruit. Um, but the problem is that a lot of people are investing in projects that have a low likelihood of bearing fruit, and the deeper problem is they don't even realize that because they haven't bothered to familiarize themselves with past research and with past knowledge, and with say evolutionary theory, economics, whatever is going to give them an edge in making sharper predictions that are more likely to bear fruit. I don't know.
I don't know, it's hard. It's hard to say. I mean, like there's a lot of scientists studying a lot of different things, but I think in the sort of behavioral sciences, I worry that it's worse than that, right? That you have
Hmm.
actually like um low quality, low risks
Yeah.
work being done.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
is,
Hmm.
it's likely to find something that uh, doesn't kind of matter.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I like one of you might even end up being a reviewer for this. I just submitted a paper that is just to be really quick. I got really frustrated because it was very much inspired by you, Paul, because I sent a paper to I'm going to say perspectives on psych science. It's good, it had a lot of theory crisis. No, it didn't go, but it was the editor desk rejected it for reasons that I was like, wow, this is selecting against good theory. And so I actually wrote a rant paper. I submitted to Perspective. So here's the premise: is that um, if you ask for data concurrent with theory, so if you select theory based on whether it it comes along with data with the theory, it selects for bad theory because it selects for basically the kinds of theories that it's easy to generate data about. So you're
Right. Or at
actually,
least theory that you don't need necessarily. It could be
yeah,
good
theory you don't
theory.
need. So so for precisely
Yeah.
theories that are about difficult things that we're not even sure how to like challenges to like I have a theory that there is this mechanism and there's a deductive logic that like there should be this like parenting mechanism, right? It
Yeah.
would be impossible for organisms to exist if it didn't exist, but we don't know how to look for it yet. We don't know how to study
Hmm.
it. The
Yeah.
idea that, that gets selected, that paper gets selected out because it doesn't have any data with it, right?
Mm.
It falls out of it falls out of the narrative of what we're even discussing. So the idea is that, I mean, the short version is asking for data concurrent with theory selects for bad theory, and I sent it to Perspectives, and it was rejected because it didn't have data.
The ultimate
Uh,
irony.
yeah, so I love this, and so this is a very much inspired by Paul Smaldino, I think, but it comes back to this thing of that, it's just what are you selecting for, right? Yeah.
I
Yeah.
know, and we if you from I mean this is also, my sort of push to like be deep in your field, but like look at other fields too, because otherwise you get totally insular and you allow things to become normative and that shouldn't be.
Yeah.
Like that. I mean, there's so many examples from other fields of theories being published and then, not finding, experimental evidence for them for years, sometimes
Yeah.
decades.
Yeah. Yeah. Paul, I want to just because we're running short on time or we're ending here. We haven't, we've ebbed and flowed in terms of like talking to guests about like themselves or like their life. But I am curious because, you have this, in my opinion, you have like a very fierce scientific identity in the sense of, you're really pushing, not in like a pushy way, but you're a spokesperson for doing models. I mean, you have papers that are like, models are stupid and we need more of them. Like that's a very special sort of stance to take. Like I'm an expert in something and it's stupid, but it's a good thing. Like that's a very special thing. It feels very different to me than what we talked about before, which is sort of people have these status games and they're just like, I'm the best. Like to say something like I'm an expert in something that's stupid and we need more of it is very subversive. So I'm just sort of curious, like we talked about, the punk rock East German thing. I mean, have you always sort of wanted to, is that you? Like, are you the punk rocker in East Germany for
Well, a
science,
punk
right?
rocker would
Yeah.
never admit
Yeah.
they would.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. Well. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I do think like a little bit of a punk attitude, I think is healthy. And I, I definitely, respond to that. And I also just feel like for me, like I've tried being more mainstream and it doesn't work. Like I
Mm,
don't feel comfortable and people reject it. Like, I tried to give more like when I was on the job market looking for academic permanent jobs, I tried to give much more typical jobs like the way that I had seen other people give them, and it just never worked, and I didn't get anything. And then I finally was just like, screw it. I'm just gonna give the talk that I want to give, and I gave a talk at UC Merced called, I think the talk was called that got me my job was called Learning about Social Evolution with Extremely Unrealistic Models.
mm,
And I was like, these models are totally unrealistic.
yeah.
But let's see what we can learn from them anyway. And I think that, we tell this like fake narrative that like the science we're doing is like so precise and we know so much. And I think like acknowledging that like we're flailing and we like it's not like people don't know anything. We know a lot of things, but there's also just so much we don't know. And being a little humble about that,
Yeah.
I think is actually a real strength. Gives, well, for me anyway, I feel like it gives me a power. And I think also like just my trajectory, like I studied physics as an undergrad. I didn't take a single class on biology, cognitive science, or psychology until grad school. And when I did, I was like, really? This? This is what we're seriously doing? And I love the topics. They're my favorite kinds of questions. I think like psychology, cognitive sciences, social sciences have the best questions. They're the things I'm most interested in. And sometimes, and it's not like everyone's doing crap work but me. Like, obviously, it's not what I'm saying. There's so many people doing work that I think is amazing and inspiring. But there's also like plenty of stuff where I'm like, come on, guys. Um, and I think that, being a little bit willing to push back on that. Also, if I'm going to say other people's, critical of other people's work, then like it's beholden to me to be just as critical about my own work.
Yeah.
And so I really try to be like, I am very careful, and I haven't always succeeded, but I try, to be pretty cautious in the claims that I'm making, and but that doesn't mean that I love speculating. Like I hate it when people are afraid to speculate because they're like, well, I don't know if I don't have the evidence. And I'm like, right, that's why you speculate. And then you see maybe you're right and maybe you're
Yeah.
wrong. Like, but if you are an expert, then like your speculation should be better than people who are not an expert, right? So like the stuff we can prove is such a small amount of the things, a small subset of the things we actually want to talk about.
Yeah.
So, um, I think that like I'm all for like, I don't know. I don't think I'm that special in the like sort of field of scientists, but I have carved out my little niche, and uh, I just keep, I'll just say the last thing I'll say is like I've done this stuff on like working on models of science and talking about like science and improving science, and it's my most cited stuff. Like the natural selection of bad science, that paper is by far my most cited paper. Um, but the idea that working on science itself is like my main life's mission is like I reject that. I don't want that to be the case. And I'm happy to be known for that, but there's so many other things. Like I'm interested in culture and the world and human behavior more generally. And it's just, that's just one aspect of it. And um, I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with that, but
Yeah. I also think this all comes back to like the original identity thing where we're all looking around and like psychologists are like, it's sort of the emperor has no clothes. We're sort of you're anticipating like what's gonna give me status, how are other people gonna react to stuff? And I think there's a paper about this where it's sort of the surprisingly popular thing where I remember we had for our wedding meal, we asked people like we have to have like these three entrees and we had like, I don't know, something like quail. And everyone was like, oh, I would love quail, but I don't think anyone else is going to. And it turned out to be a really good idea that we had quail for the meal because everybody wanted, but nobody thought anyone else did, but they thought they did. And what this paper is about, surprisingly popular, is something where you respond to something, but you don't think anyone else will. And I think like the value of like having a paper like models are stupid, we should have more of them, is it removes that it's sort of that courage to sort of be like it's standing out like it's rocking the boat a little bit
yeah,
but then people can be like oh there is somebody else who's like these things are useful but they are kind of stupid and we don't have to like pretend like everybody agrees that they're not stupid
yeah,
and maybe it kind of um it gives some error to otherwise everybody's like pretending like well I think everybody must think they're right. I might think they're stupid but nobody else does and you being a little bit courageous to be like well they're dumb but let's use them like I think that helps people realize that they're not alone.
yeah. I think that's right. I can't remember what book it's in, but there was this. I remember a long time ago reading this something by Kurt Vonnegut where he talks about in one of his books and about how like one of the great things about writing is that like somebody you've never met can read something that like expresses a perspective on the world and says, "Hey, me too. I think that way
Yeah.
too." And that like that feeling of, "Hey, I'm not alone in thinking this,"
Yeah.
is hugely powerful, and it's like one of the things that really like ties me and I think a lot of us to like the works of art that we love and the works of writing, fiction or non, that we love. And so I think like, to the extent that like I can be that for even like a handful of people is that's huge to me. I get
Yeah.
a lot
Yeah.
of
Well,
gratification.
it was for me, honestly. Like honestly, the like I'm like, this is ridiculous. There's good work and there's clearly selection for status. It was really it kept me in this to know that other people were thinking the same way.
Hmm. To tie it back full circle, it is perhaps the feeling of a covert signal well received.
Exactly.
And
Well
to
done,
be
Dave.
part of a community that you didn't know
Yeah.
existed.
Yeah.
Um, so, Paul, is there anything that we should have asked you during this time, or did we get it all?
I mean, I'm sure that you got a very small amount, but
Yes,
Yeah.
because we all contain multitudes. But
it's
I
true.
feel very, very happy with the conversation.
Yeah.
I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's true.
Cool.
Can you demonstrate at least one thing behind, like what there for the people who are just listening, but like, we also are on YouTube. You have guitars and you've got a solar system or something behind you. What is that?
Well, I'm not going to play guitar on the podcast, but
Okay, no, that's
I
for
do. I,
subscribe. We don't have subscribers, but if we did, that would be bonus content. You have to pay to listen to Paul.
uh, you can some of the music by my old garage band, the Small Dinosaurs, is available on
Oh,
streaming
fantastic.
services.
Oh, so
People
it's called
free.
Small Dinosaurs. I will put a link in the show notes. So it's Small Dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Okay.
Um, and then this is a Lego Technic. It's a sun and moon and Earth, and the Earth spins and the sun spins, and the Earth goes around the sun and the moon goes around the Earth. And I'm twisting a little lever, and it can show you like where the relative positions of the sun, the moon, and the Earth are at different times of year.
Awesome.
And it's a very old technology, but Lego made one, and I got it for Christmas, and we
That's
were talking about
awesome.
it earlier. I think it's really neat. Um,
That's
so props to Lego. So
Yeah, awesome. Yeah. Lego, please sponsor the podcast. No, I'm kidding. Oh, look at that. At the very end, I'm shilling to corporate. Yeah, anyway, but yeah.
I mean, if you're going to shill to a corporation, Lego's a pretty good one.
Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
a lot of wonderful changes to human brains done by Lego, and that's saying a lot.
That sounds like really dark.
It's a very reductive way to put it. It's
I
like
don't know if you know about Lego's secret laboratory where they're changing
yeah,
people's
no, I
brains.
know. It's exactly. I'm just like, I don't know, like Coca-Cola's just dump people full of sugar. Lego, it's like
No, it's
push
Honestly,
change
educational.
the
it's
It's
been, but
yeah,
yeah, I feel like I kind of think in Legos, and I feel like that's a good thing. I don't know,
yeah,
to think in terms of how the pieces fit together and how it works. I don't know.
yeah. And like perseverance and planning and mental
Hmm.
rotation and
Yeah,
creativity and autonomy and all those things. But yeah,
yeah.
no, fair enough. All right. Well, uh maybe on that note, I don't know. Paul, do you want to have the last word?
potato.
Awesome.
All
On
right.
that
Great
note.
last word.
All right, Paul. Yeah, I'll stop recording, but it was great, man.
Yep.
Oh yeah, thanks. This is fun.
David, I really enjoyed this conversation with Paul. Did you enjoy it?
I loved it. I had a
Okay.
blast.
All right. And if you did enjoy it, please help us by spreading the word. If you just tell one other person, then they'll might listen to it as well. I can't tell you how many people who I've emailed as like even a guest to come on who said I didn't know about the podcast. So um, and then they listen to it and at least 90% of the time they say, oh, it actually was pretty good.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, unless they're all lying to us so they don't hurt our feelings,
Yeah,
people have
maybe
been
the
pretty
people who
positive about
never
it.
got back to me are like, that was bad. I mean, occasionally people leave bad reviews, but that's okay.
But if you're one of the people who does enjoy the podcast and is willing to tell us the truth about that, um, then maybe share that truth with others by saying a kind word about us on social media, leaving us a kind review, visiting us on Patreon. There are many ways to show your support, and your support is what keeps us going and keeps this thing going. So please show it.
That and caffeine.
Yeah. You could send us some coffee grounds, preferably in a fanny pack. That would be fantastic.
What a, and we'll leave you with that image till we see you next week or hear from you next
All
week.
right.
Okay.
See you next week.